Now, I showed you earlier some of US President Joe Biden's speech to Congress and some of the focus on racism issues. But there's more to look at. It was a big spending affair, with the pandemic response being used to justify eye-watering levels of expenditure, of course. And there was also economic nationalism that sounded one hell of a lot like the bloke who was in the White House last year.
American tax dollars are going to be used to buy American products made in America to create American jobs. That's the way it's supposed to be, and it will be in this administration.
Man, Donald J. Biden, hey? Biden certainly didn't lack optimism or self-belief either. I mean, he effectively promised to cure cancer.
So let's end cancer as we know it. It's within our power. It's within our power to do it.
On a more positive note, there was a bit of comfort for Australia, with Biden recounting his discussions with Chinese President Xi Jinping and saying that he promised to stand up to China.
I also told President Xi that we'll maintain a strong military presence in the Indo-Pacific, just as we do for NATO and Europe. Not to start a conflict, but to prevent one.
OK, so he says, and that's good, but that's as far as I can go, I'm afraid, when it comes to being positive. This speech had the usual collage of platitudes and patriotism, but the real howler, a very revealing howler, came right at the start.
Tonight, I come to talk about crisis and opportunity, about rebuilding the nation, revitalizing our democracy, and winning the future for America. I stand here tonight, one day shy of the 100th day of my administration. 100 days since I took the oath of office and lifted my hand off our family Bible and inherited a nation, we all did, that was in crisis. The worst pandemic in a century, the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, the worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War.
Say what? The worst attack on American democracy since the Civil War? A riot in which the rioters did not kill, I repeat, the rioters, disgraceful as they were, did not kill a single person. One rioter was killed, and a handful of people died from natural causes. Much media has pretended otherwise. Nonetheless, it was a horrible riot and an affront to democracy. But the worst attack on democracy since the Civil War? He can't be serious. Since the Civil War, for instance, 4 presidents have been assassinated. Were they not attacks on democracy? Other politicians, candidates, Bobby Kennedy, political staffers, governors and civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King, have been shot and killed. Were these not also attacks on democracy? Has Joe Biden not heard of Pearl Harbor? It happened just a year before he was born. Was that not an attack on US democracy? The race riots of the 60s and the 90s, horrific domestic terror attacks, and of course, the 9/11 atrocities killing almost 3,000 innocents in New York City and in Washington, D.C. Were they not attacks on American democracy? No, none of those matched up to the Capitol Hill riots, according to Joe Biden. Talk about trying to use guilt by association to demonise your opponents. Amazing stuff. I spoke earlier to Miranda Devine in the US, where she's writing for the New York Post and for Sydney's Daily Telegraph, and I got her impressions of the speech.
Well, I mean, it's like opposite day, Chris. Everything that Joe Biden said tonight, he actually is doing the opposite. You know, Mr. Unity, Mr. Moderation is doing more to divide the country, to ratchet up racial divisions, to be the most radical left-wing president that America's ever seen. And yet he's still pretending somehow to be this unifying, healing, moderate force, the real anti-Trump. And, you know, I think that with tonight's speech, you heard everything you needed to know about this very divisive, very dishonest president in the first 2 minutes, because he launched into this lie that January 6th, the Capitol riot, he said was the biggest attack on American democracy since the Civil War. Now, that's just not true. It's a malignant lie, and it's aimed at demonising Trump supporters, basically half the country. You know, there's been Pearl Harbor, there's been 9/11, there have been 4 assassinations and 2 attempted assassinations of presidents. There have been numerous attacks on members of Congress, including one in 2017 by a Bernie Sanders Democrat that almost killed Representative Steve Scalise, who was then the Speaker. So for Joe Biden to pretend that what was a riot, which was just a culmination of a summer of riots across America in which you know, almost 24 people were killed and hundreds of police officers were injured and $2 billion at least of damage was done, to pretend that the Capitol Hill riot was somehow equivalent to 9/11 or Pearl Harbor or the assassinations is really very dishonest and really reckless and divisive.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. He's trying to catastrophise that and talk about it as a crisis moment and a pivot moment for the nation. And the only reason you would want to do that and exaggerate that is to divide the nation. I suppose there was one germ in his speech that might have been of some comfort to Australians, and that is that he said that American military presence in the Indo-Pacific would continue to dominate the region. In other words, he's saying that under him, the American military will continue to contain China, for want of a better word.
Well, we'll see. You know, we've seen already today the Iranians are aggressing like they did during the Obama administration on American warships. You just don't have that strength that you were projecting from America when America's adversaries didn't know what Donald Trump was up to, and when you had Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State, who was pretty tough. You don't have that anymore. You've got these milquetoasts you saw with Anthony Blinken, who's the Secretary of State, who's a very close long-term ally of Joe Biden, how he was just eviscerated by the Chinese in Alaska a few weeks ago. Foreign policy under Joe Biden is very weak, projecting weakness.
Now, I just want to get your thoughts too, Miranda, on New York City. Of course, it's your base these days. You wrote about it in the Daily Telegraph this week. The New York City that so many Australians have come to know and love post-pandemic is just not there anymore.
Well, you wouldn't recognise it if anyone from Australia came over here. I live in an area called Hell's Kitchen, which is just a gentrifying area, or was gentrifying, not anymore, just to the west of Times Square. And, you know, the Mayor, Bill de Blasio, who's just a shocker, he has installed all these homeless and vagrants and people that they've sprung from prison because of COVID, mentally ill and drug addicts, into hotels in the area. I mean, he's done it all over the city, but there's been a huge concentration in about 10 hotels in this area. There are no longer any tourists, and so of course the hotel owners, who also happen to be Bill de Blasio's biggest donors, they're very happy with the taxpayer money. But what it means is that the neighbourhoods around these hotels have become almost unlivable. And you know, as an example, I mean, public defecation is a big problem. Open air sex is another big problem. This is what the police are getting called out for. There's just, you know, one hotel notorious over on 10th Avenue, the Skyline Hotel. The police are called out there at least 4 times a day for all sorts of antisocial behaviour and a violent crime. So this is just repeated across the city. And, you know, the other day there was a tourist, there are a few brave tourists coming back because now you've got half the country pretty much vaccinated. And a tourist from Kansas City arrived in Times Square a couple of weeks ago to watch the baseball, and he ended up getting shot in the shoulder with a stray bullet. And that's just, you know, a day in the life of the big city.
Here was me, Miranda, being envious of your time in New York City. I'm happy right here for now. Great to talk to you again. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, New York City. Hey, just going back to Joe Biden and that speech too, what about all the masks? So, they've all been vaccinated. They're socially distancing, but the masks are on. Were they there for a medical reason or for political theatre? Interesting, isn't it?